The Demon Souls bosses are extremely basic when it comes to movesets. Some bosses don't even have attack combos, like after one swing, it's a guaranteed opening. But even when they do have attack combos, they're only lasting 3 hits at most. So the concept of these complex boss combos where memorization or trial and error is at the forefront wasn't the primary focus back in 2009. Instead, the Demon Souls boss formula was to implement differing mechanics and gimmicks to make these boss fights distinguishable from the regular enemy. Just for some examples, the Adjudicator is a boss that can be fought by either using the platforms to shoot projectiles at its head, or to use melee weapons at his weak spot near his stomach to make him fall down to the ground. The Old Hero is a boss that cannot see the character, but he relies on sound, so you actually can manipulate the fight to take his lack of sight to your advantage. The Fool's Idol is a boss that leaves clones and traps scattered throughout the entire boss room, and then you have bosses like the Storm King or Dragon God, where your build doesn't matter and the game gives you the tools to beat it inside of the boss room. All of these bosses are designed to be fought differently than your regular enemy. That was the formula for the boss fights back then. They didn't necessarily have harder to read attacks than your average trash mob, but you had to fight them using unconventional methods that made them harder and more memorable. Now, they still weren't that challenging for today's standards, but that's because the bosses in Demon Souls were balanced around the level itself. The concept, the theme, and the difficulty of the boss were all tied to the level, so you had to do them all in one fell swoop. There were no checkpoints right outside the boss room, and the major difficulty came from the Gimmick. Now, does that sound familiar at all? But before we do talk about Nightreign and its Everdark bosses, I do want to first highlight how we ended up shifting away from the Demon Souls boss formula to begin with, because it is very apparent that over time, we didn't see these types of bosses that often. They slowly phased away, and with the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, I thought they were gone for good. They pretty much tripled down on every major boss having a complex moveset with no real differing mechanic or gimmick. And this is obviously due to the feedback or the discussions around boss fights themselves. Like 90% of people's favorite fights are the non-gimmick fights that look cool and have fun movesets to learn. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you ask, FromSoftware decided to go all in on that direction while sacrificing the variety. Now, I can tell that a lot of people hearing that statement right there will end up going, well, I like to have variety. I wish you had more of it. But what if I told you that a boss fight like Midra or Bale was actually a gimmick fight where they had a Demon Souls-like mechanic to counter and not these complex movesets? I guarantee a lot of people don't like the sound of that. And that is the exact same thing that happens to Everdark Libra. Most people that had Libra be one of their favorite fights were very disappointed to see that the boss fight turned into a gimmick fight. Now for me, bosses like Midra, Bale, and Libra are really good, but they're not my favorites, so if they were to be somewhat gimmicky, I wouldn't really mind. However, alternatively, if they changed bosses like Mesmer or Hjolster, which are fights that I completely adore, then I would feel some type of way about it. And that is part of the issue right there. FromSoftware recognize how much more the average person prefers the cool moveset over the gimmick ones, and then people will end up picking their favorites based on how cool they look, the first impression, and honestly how much they didn't suck during the fight too. Now, the reason why I said that that was part of the issue is because the other part of the issue is that the actual gimmick fights that they've made after Demon Souls, they kind of suck. Dark Souls 1 bosses are mostly glorified mini-bosses with nothing really special, but even when they did design something more unique, they came up with bosses like Ceaseless Discharge, Bed of Chaos, Pinwheel, Gwendolyn, which are all just so basic or terribly clunky to actually make a good boss fight. Now, thankfully, they did make some decent gank boss fights in the Bell Gargoyles and Ornstein and Smo, which are infinitely better than the monstrosity that is the Man-Eaters. And I know a lot of people nowadays consider Ornstein and Smo to be mid, which it makes sense being that they haven't aged as well. But this shit was like our Gale or our Mesmer back in the day. Like, that's how well liked he was. Dark Souls 1 boss discourse back then always praised Ornstein and Smo way before you even got to bosses like Artorias. And it was for the reason that it was such a great concept of a fight. But being that exact same concept was done better in Dark Souls 3, and how heavily people prefer the boss formula nowadays, Artorias is kind of widely considered to be the best boss in Dark Souls 1, which it's kind of sad to see the lack of appreciation for Ornstein and Smough. Like, they will always be my favorite Dark Souls 1 boss, I don't care what anyone says. Now, when it does come to Dark Souls 2, they obviously had a lot of unique concepts, and most were good. And actually, in fact, the unoriginal concepts were the ones that kind of sucked, because half of them was like, remember Dark Souls 1? Like with Najika, it was like, remember Quelaag? Well, now she's worse. Remember Sif the dog? Well, now that one sucks too. Remember Ornstein and Smough? Well, this time we just removed the only interesting part of the fight. Do you guys remember how the rooftop gargoyles were a really memorable fight for a lot of good reasons? Well, now they're just not that memorable at all. Now, part of the reason why this was the case is because that this is just the curse of making a sequel for the most part, which is why FromSoft shouldn't make any more, but that's a conversation for another day. Anyway, the unique concepts for Dark Souls 2 were done very well. The Flexile Sentry having a different moveset depending on which side that you're on, and you're fighting in a sinking pirate ship. The Lost Sinner and Mytha have these prerequisites to the fight to make them easier. Freya only having 2 points where you can actually do damage while dealing with these trash mobs makes positioning and camera placement be very important. The Looking Glass Knight brings back the Invader boss from Demon Souls, but in a much cooler way. All these ideas were mostly good. Some didn't have the greatest execution, but the concepts were there, and you could use these concepts as a foundation to build upon for your next games, because they were already doing a great job with the cool boss movesets, especially the ones in the DLC. But how do they evolve the Gimmick fight? They didn't. They didn't evolve it at all. Starting off with the next game, Bloodborne, and its bosses, oh boy, Not only were the gimmick fights in this game completely obnoxious, but they also lacked originality. Vacuous Rom was very much another version of Freya, but somehow worse, being that the fight was either deal with endless waves of one-shotting spiders, or just ignore the spiders and melt the boss really quickly while it flails around. The one Reborn is just a direct ripoff of the Tower Knight fight from Demon Souls, and it's just worse due to the boss having a borderline unrecognizable moveset and AoEs falling from the sky outside of the camera. The Celestial Emissary is just another Royal Rat Vanguard, but at least they look cute. Witches of Hemwick can go invisible like Priscilla, but it's kind of not really that comparable, and the fight just sucks anyway, so who cares? And then you have Mikolash, which is just like, ugh. Like, there's something there when it comes to like a chasing puzzle boss, but when your reward for beating this very basic puzzle is this shit, it's so ass. Like, it really is. And they did try this exact same thing again with the monkeys in Sekiro, but it was kind of the same thing. Like, the puzzles were just like too basic for what they were trying to go for, and it just made the experience like a bit too boring and obnoxious. Now, outside of the gimmick fights, the Bloodborne bosses, they do pretty well. Now, a lot of them do suffer from things like flailing around a lot and having incredibly fast movesets, but that's because the game is balanced around the gun parry. Like, these bosses are very much designed for you to get hit, which for me is a bit of a downside as it makes the gameplay pretty restrictive as to what you can use for certain bosses. For instance, fighting a boss like Gurman or Orphan of Kos second phase without the gun is definitely one of the experiences of all time. But they're still great bosses otherwise. Now, as for the nail in the coffin for the gimmick fights, we have Dark Souls 3. This game is where the community wholeheartedly decided that gimmick fights are trash and we should only get cool moveset fights. Nobody cared to fight the Crystal Sage, which was just Pinwheel with more health. Nobody cares about the Curse-Rotted Greatwood because it looked stupid and had 3 attacks. Deacons of the Deep is a boss fight that exists, and then you have Wolnir, which had the potential to be a cool gimmick, but it felt so basic and lazy. They did also bring back the Storm Ruler fight in Yom, which the original Storm King fight was very cinematic, and it was very cool using the Storm Ruler. And this is slightly true for Yom, but unfortunately they decided to make the weapon so incredibly boring to use, as the only difficult part of the fight is just waiting 5 seconds to charge up the skill, which I can't think of a more unfun concept. Like, if you're making a gimmick fights like this, the number one thing that you do is make the main weapon actually enjoyable to use. And they didn't do that. Thankfully, they did do so with Rykard, because giving the player more freedom in movesets and having the boss fight always be at a distance made this be the best of all the Storm Ruler fights. And while we are on the topic, the Divine Dragon from Sekiro was also done very well, because once again, if you are making a gimmick fight like this, you have to make it very fun and cinematic, and they definitely knocked it out of the park with this one. Also, no, Yorm without the Stormruler is actually terrible as well. He only gets one weak spot, so the entire fight is just circling around his leg, just waiting for him to slam his weapon down. Now, I'm sure when I talked about Dark Souls 2 bosses and how some of them are just like, hey, remember Dark Souls 1? People are probably yelling at the screen saying, well, Dark Souls 3 is like that as well, right? Yes, you are correct. But they were mostly good, so it gets a pass. Because yeah, a lot of the cool moveset bosses are fantastic. They got more cinematic and complex, but not too complex to where it forces the average player to spend hours memorizing a fight. Now, due to the success of those bosses, it pretty much had FromSoftware double down into that formula. In fact, the bosses were so liked in Dark Souls 3 that the bosses became the forefront of the Souls games for a lot of people. Like from a discussion perspective, the most popular question that I get in my stream nowadays is which one is my favorite boss? But also number 2, from a promotional perspective, having clips and people's stories be shared about certain boss fights brought so much more attention to this game, and this is very much true for Elden Ring as well. Like the Millennia boss fight. This one fight alone is more infamous than all the Dark Souls bosses combined. And FromSoft knew exactly what they were doing by having her be at the front of a lot of promotional material. Like, she's literally the main statue for the collector's edition. Yet this boss is the most optional of all time. She's hidden behind a secret item, that's hidden behind a secret area, that's hidden behind a secret puzzle, that unlocks another secret area, and she's at the very end of that. And yet, the most watched and viewed part of people's playthroughs is this one boss fight. And it's purely because of the difficulty, which the difficulty is the very thing that made Dark Souls infamous in the gaming community to begin with, because Dark Souls was just known as that hard game. It was a game that people recommended to others just to watch them suffer, because Dark Souls and Demon Souls was released in an era of gaming that was getting heavily casualized, and FromSoft kind of put hard gaming back on the map. And yes, there are a lot of games nowadays that are harder than the FromSoft ones, but it definitely was an anomaly back then. And this notoriety and difficulty is what helped gather a lot more attention to the game. And this is also true for Millennia. This pretty princess right here was put on a pedestal just waiting for the endless slew of articles and clips to be made about her. Like, her entire existence alone probably helped sell at least 1 million copies of this game. She is the final form of the Soulsborne complex moveset boss. Now, I know some people do find Consort Radahn to be harder, but it's only because that he doesn't have as many direct counters to be cheesed like Millennia can. But Consort Radahn's moveset isn't that complex, and in fact, he doesn't even have the most complex moveset out of the entire DLC. And when it comes to intricacies of moveset, there is no FromSoft boss more complicated than Millennia. She has combos on top of combos that all happen based on either RNG, positioning, spacing, damage being dealt, the length of the fight, what actions and weapons are being used. She is the epitome of trial and error, and there was never a single chance in hell that Millennia was going to be nerfed, because she was intentionally designed to be bullshit just to bring attention to the game. And that's why she's also the most optional boss too. If she was mandatory, she would have been nerfed, just like Radahn was. But back to the topic at hand, a lot of bosses in Elden Ring tend to fall under this category. Every single boss just feels like it could be the final boss. They all have movesets that take a long time to memorize, which makes them great for replay value. Too bad there's no boss rush mode or boss replaying mode. But yeah, the first time around, it can get very tiring. It's like nice when you come up across different types of bosses to change up the pace, or maybe have some cannon fodder bosses to like improve your morale. However, if I were to fight these hypothetical cannon fodder bosses or gimmick bosses on successive playthroughs, I wouldn't like them as much, but it would still be preferred. I love the Elden Ring bosses and how complex they can be, because there isn't any other game that feels as rewarding for conquering these behemoths of bosses by doing these like +0 weapon runs or level 1 runs. Like, it feels great. But what if you're a person that doesn't want to spend forever memorizing a boss? In Dark Souls 3, it was very common to kill these like so-called tough bosses within your first 5 attempts. But if you want to do something like that in this game, it's probably not going to be because you've memorized the fight, but more so because you have a really good build, which that's why the Elden Ring bosses are the way that they are, because the build creation is so good and you can get so powerful that they almost have to make these bosses be very challenging. So there's those that like to use really great builds to melt bosses, and then there's those that like to spend lots of time memorizing bosses with average builds, but then there's the players that want to use average builds but not be stuck for hours on every single boss. They want it to be like Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. Like you can just take an average build into the game and not have to go through ridiculous amounts of trial and error every single step of the way. And that's a lot of the reason why some of like the core OG FromSoft fans aren't messing with this game, is because the boss formula isn't playing like the older games. Like, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, like these OG FromSoftware gamers, they're getting older. These are older people now. Their reaction times are getting slower. They have more important things to do than spend hours on every single boss. Like, for whatever reason that it is, the Elden Ring boss formula is not going to be for everyone. But if you're FromSoftware, what do you do now? Because a lot of other gamers are getting really good at the game and they're getting used to this fast combat with these over-the-top movesets. Can you really go back to cater towards those people? And if you do, how much of the player base are you now hurting? Like, FromSoftware is just at the point right now where they're so big, they can never win anymore. Every game that they put out at this point is going to have mixed opinions from the fan base, because FromSoftware catered towards so many people over the years that they can never please everyone at once, even when they do try. Now enter Elden Ring Nightreign. This game falls under a completely different genre, the roguelike genre, which is very heavily balanced around trial and error. You're meant to fail over and over until you get comfortable enough so you can pretty much win 90% of the time. Now, being that in this genre, there is no checkpoints right outside the boss, and that it's up to RNG to make the optimal build, it's natural that these bosses are not balanced like they are in Elden Ring. They are inherently easier bosses because, just like in Demon Souls, the bosses are balanced around the level to be done in one fell swoop. Now, people like to talk about the 30-minute boss run back, which is mainly for jokes because, it is a different genre, and it also takes 30 minutes to run back when you beat the boss too. Whereas if you beat the final boss in the other Souls games, you have to beat the entire game all over again. So does that mean that Gwyn and Radagon have a 3 to 6 hour run back? No, it's not, because you're playing the game, just like in Nightreign. Anyway, the main Knights Lord bosses, they do have variety and aesthetic, theme, and size, but gameplay-wise, they don't really differ much mechanically. It's very much the usual cool moveset boss fight, just like even more cinematic this time. But gameplay speaking, these bosses are very much catered towards the wants of the player base, once again, leaving the variety behind. But in FromSoftware's genius, they decided that this game was the perfect opportunity to remix their main bosses to offer a different and more unique experience. And this has me incredibly hopeful for the future. If you are unfamiliar with Nightreign, roughly every single week they dropped a new version of an already existing boss in these Everdark Sovereign variants. They come with a couple of different attacks, slightly different visuals, and they also have some differing gameplay mechanics. Adele, Baron of Night, summons a big giant tornado mid-fight where it restricts the size of the boss arena. Noster turns into a triple fight from a double boss fight, and the new boss is the one that needs to be damaged to defeat the boss, but you can only reliably damage him once he takes over the corpse of one of the other two bosses killed. Maris, Fathom of Night, brings the Storm Ruler fight back. Unfortunately, it isn't as fun to use as a Serpent Hunter, but at least it is more enjoyable than the Dark Souls 3 Storm Ruler. And the fight isn't really super action-packed, it is more calm and methodical with the fight, which that is up to preference as well. The Everdark Libra fight changed so many things, and we will get into more detail about that, do not worry. But then you have bosses like Everdark Gladius and Fulgor, which didn't change much mechanically, but they just enhanced their moveset to be more complex or more cinematic. Now, based on everything I've said in this video so far, which of these bosses do you think was well received? If you ended up guessing Gladius and Fulgor, you would be correct, because these fights didn't get a gimmick, they just got cooler movesets. And you know what's funny? These are some of my favorite fights too. I love all the cool moveset bosses, all like the basic knight bosses from every game. They're my favorite ones. And as much as I appreciate interesting bosses, none of them are really gonna top my list because the only reason why I do want them is to make the other cool bosses stand out more. Like if every Everdark boss worked like Everdark Fulgore, it would feel pretty stale and not as special. But you know, that's just my opinion. Other people really wanted every Everdark boss to be just like Fulgore. And that's why when it came to one of the more liked bosses in Libra, there was a lot of pushback and outrage when it turned into an NPC ganking gimmick boss fight. Now look, NPCs are awful to fight in basically every game. They don't have set or distinct movesets, so there really isn't much to learn, and specifically for Elden Ring NPCs, they're riddled with obnoxious input reading, jumping attack spam, and infinite stamina. It would have been a lot better if these are regular enemies or unique enemies instead of having an NPC, or even having it be a PvP boss fight would have been pretty interesting and cool, just like how we had with the Old Monk, Looking Glass Knight, and Half-Light. But even then, as bad as the NPCs are, I love the boss fight. And this is actually the first time that it feels like I'm actually fighting a next-gen and actual high-effort gimmick fight. It's the closest that we've really gotten to like an MMO raid boss. Now, for those unfamiliar, Everdark Libra has a bunch of different modifiers and mechanics that he cycles through roughly once a minute. And true to the theme of Libra and its equal scales, every modifier grants a buff and a debuff. They range from things like giving you infinite heals, but every time you heal, you lose a level. There's also one where your health gets cut in half, but so does everybody else in the boss room. He can summon additional NPCs, but all these NPCs can end up fighting each other, even the boss. There's also another one that applies madness to everybody's weapons. And all of this is happening while you gotta fight NPCs, keep an eye out for the boss, while also dealing with the arena being split up into 4 different sections, and you'll get damage if you leave your own section. Things like positioning, spacing, camera control are just super important. Like the fight is so incredibly engaging and chaotic that I just adore it. And it really is the only fight in the entire game that I genuinely really enjoy as a group, because like typically I just always just like every boss a lot more in solo play. And the most pleasantly surprising thing is that it's challenging and it feels modern. Ever since Dark Souls 3, I was convinced that the gimmick boss fight, or the fight that required unconventional methods, was just doomed to be too simple or easy, and that there isn't really room for this type of boss in this day and age. But no. As annoying as NPCs are, this boss fight sparked some hope in me for the future of the FromSoftware boss fights. So yeah, in my opinion, these Everdark bosses are a great success. It doesn't hurt to have additional variants of boss fights that cover different gameplay styles and aesthetics. Like, they really use this as an opportunity to cater to everyone while making the fights still stand out individually. Now, does everybody in the fanbase feel the same way? No, of course not. I've been playing these games for over 10 years. Of course, I'm gonna value originality and not want to have the same things over and over again or have sequels to these games. I want to see lots of original stuff. But a lot of the fan base is actually new and haven't been playing these games for as long, so from their perspective, it's like, yeah, give us 10 more cool moveset night boss fights, because why not? So in conclusion, like, the major takeaway is that if you like some of the stuff that FromSoftware has done, but you also didn't like some things that they've done, prepare to be disappointed in the future, because FromSoftware is going to cover different aesthetics and genres to get more people playing their games, and they're going to have to try and cater towards all those people. And unfortunately, it can't all be done at once. So I don't doubt that they will make bosses and games that are right up your alley, but don't be surprised when they don't. The only thing that I ask for the player base is just don't be insufferable about it by pretending that certain games are objectively better than others, as if people's preferences just like don't exist. Like, if somebody likes Nightreign the best, just let them. If somebody hates Nightreign, let them. As long as they're not a dick about it, then who cares what people's preferences are? The whole community acts as if we all have to be on the exact same page, as if these games don't already cater towards many different types of gamers. People like and play games for different reasons. So stop being corny, it's annoying. But anyway, that is all that I want to cover in this one, just like a bunch of like rambling and yapping about the bosses. I will be making lots more Soulsborne content coming along the way. There will be some more Nightreign content as well. So if any of those things do interest you, please do like and subscribe, and I'll catch you all around. See yas!